There's no doubt that the Unabomber was a cold-hearted, calculating killer. And in his journals, he expressed almost no remorse for his victims. But those who knew Theodore Kaczynski remember a very different man, one who was gentle and unthreatening. So what caused him to snap? Forrest Sawyer looked for the roots in Kaczynski's early childhood.
Growing up in the Chicago suburb of Evergreen Park in the 1950s, David Kaczynski always looked up to his brother Ted, 7 years older. But even then, something seemed wrong.
I recall asking my father in my early teens, Ted is really different. What's wrong with Ted? How come he doesn't have friends? He believed that someday Ted would find a wife and get married, and he would become more social. He would become less odd.
The letters Kaczynski wrote years later reveal how futile that hope was to be.
I am tormented by bitter regret at never having had the opportunity to experience the love of a woman.
He blamed his mother for his problems relating to people and wrote that he would hate the family forever.
I have got to know that every last tie joining me to this stinking family has been cut forever.
Apparently, Ted believes that he was abused as a child. You can imagine nothing could possibly be more painful than my mom to know this.
The Kaczynskis, by all accounts a loving family, noticed Ted's problems early on. When he was only 9 months old, he became sick and taken to the hospital, was separated from his mother for 3 days.
When she came back, Ted made no eye contact with her. He was extremely withdrawn. She has described him as like a rag doll in her arms.
Today, psychiatrists who have examined Kaczynski say the hospital trauma may have hurt him, but the roots of mental illness were planted from the day he was born.
The person is born with a vulnerable brain, and if this person, as they develop, has to go through events which are traumatic psychologically, that sets them up ever more to sort of be tipping over the edge.
You make it sound as though there's a bomb ticking in his head.
It is a ticking bomb in the sense that it will go off, and there is a limited amount that one can do to prevent it.
Withdrawn, but intellectually brilliant, Ted skipped grade after grade. The boy who could not relate to those his own age was now with others, even older.
One teacher said, and this is, to me, a tragic statement, we didn't know what to do with him, we just pushed him on. What a tragedy. What an incompetent statement for a teacher to make, in my opinion.
Imagine not being able to understand nuances of facial expression. In Ted's case, since he didn't understand the social nuances at all, it was pretty devastating socially.
We always teased because he always had all of his books and his papers in this briefcase, and he'd set it down, and that's just the image. That skinny little kid always in a hurry with his briefcase.
From the age of about 8 on, I have consistently experienced one form or another of social rejection from most of the groups with which I have been associated.
Despite his difficulties, at just 16, Ted Kaczynski won a National Merit Scholarship and was accepted at Harvard. One of his roommates was Patrick McIntosh.
Ted would not volunteer to join in conversations with anybody. He would go in his room and shut the door, and I thought perhaps he just hadn't grown up yet.
No one knows why, but at Harvard, Kaczynski volunteered for psychological testing, and the results should have set off alarm bells, say doctors who recently reviewed them.
We see clear signs that this was a kid in trouble. Nothing was done at that time.
A few years later, at graduate school in mathematics at the University of Michigan, Kaczynski suffered his first real breakdown. He became suicidal and grew increasingly confused about his sexual identity. He tried talking to a psychiatrist, but felt so humiliated he couldn't discuss his feelings. Kaczynski's shame turned to rage, directed at the doctor.
This is where he first talked of killing someone.
I believe so, yes.
At the time, David and the family did not know of Ted's desperation and resisted thinking of him as ill. even when, at the age of 24, he threw a fit after the family home was sold.
My mother describes that as the movers were coming into the house, Ted was following her around, kind of whispering excitedly under his breath that she had to make them leave.
What was that about?
I think Ted very much needed a place where he felt safe, that the dismantling of the house is like the tearing apart of the psyche.
So why weren't his repeated outbursts and erratic behavior enough to warn them?
Do you think you were in denial?
Sure. Our family accommodated what was different about Ted. I think my mother particularly didn't want to have him stigmatized or labeled as mentally ill or weird.
Ironically, as Ted was sinking deeper into mental illness, his work was more brilliant than ever. An award-winning doctoral thesis at the University of Michigan, and then a teaching position at the University of California, Berkeley.
Number 8.
1967, a turbulent time. But Kaczynski remained cloistered in his apartment, disliked by his students, barely remembered by his colleagues. In only 2 years, with no explanation, he quit and moved back to live with his parents.
He talked to me at times about how uncomfortable he felt around people. He talked about how there had been times when he wished he was the only human being alive.
It was a feeling which landed him in the most isolated place he could find, Montana. In 1971, Kaczynski built a simple one-room cabin on a small plot of land. Now, safe in his isolation, there was time to think.
And so the person struggles to make sense of what's happening. Why is all this stuff coming at me? And the person starts to come up with an explanation for it. Organized society can't stand people like me. I'm too much of a threat to them. And perhaps it's because I've really figured something out about it. And perhaps I'm the one who has the important message.
That year, Kaczynski wrote a 23-page essay he mailed to his brother David.
Technology has already made it impossible for us to live as physically independent beings.
Ideas that would eventually take shape as the Unabomber's manifesto. But for years he lived without plumbing or electricity, tending his small garden and hunting squirrels and rabbits for food. Then, in May 1978, Kaczynski set off his first bomb.
I came back to the Chicago area in May, mainly for one reason, so that I could more safely attempt to murder a scientist, businessman, or the like.
He lived with his parents for the time and took a job in a rubber factory working under his younger brother. He tried dating a co-worker at the plant, Ellen Tarmichael, who later found herself besieged by the press.
Later, we went to pick apples and then returned to his parents' home where we baked an apple pie. It was on that occasion that I informed Ted that I did not wish to see him further on a social basis because I felt we didn't have much in common besides our employment.
Kaczynski was humiliated by the gentle rejection and then enraged. All over the factory, he pasted limericks ridiculing Tarmichael. David was forced to fire his own brother.
Several times within his life, he made efforts to come out of his isolation and connect with a female.
And always very awkwardly.
Apparently so, yes.
A year later, Ted Kaczynski was back in Montana. Secretly, he had finally begun his campaign in earnest.
My life in the woods has been ruined by progress.
He vandalized loggers' cabins, poured sugar in their gas tanks, and destroyed a road-building tractor in the forest nearby.
This revenge was particularly satisfying.
Only when FBI agents later showed him entries from Kaczynski's journals did Chris Waits discover this side of his Montana neighbor of 25 years.
I mean, cruel and horrible things. Stringing a neck wire across a trail to snag a motorcyclist because Ted didn't think that they should be riding motorcycles into this particular area that was roadless. Things like that that just enraged him.